My son looked me in the eye and said, "You're just another mouth to feed." Then he handed me a janitor's uniform and told me to clean floors like a beggar. His wife laughed about sending me to a nursing home, stealing the pension I worked my whole life for. But what they didn't know was that one truth, revealed in the company corridor, would turn their world upside down. I had been waiting for that night for years. Retirement was supposed to be the reward for a lifetime of hard work, a moment of relief when the weight of the world finally eased off my shoulders. I walked into the kitchen with a smile that stretched wider than it had in months. The meatloaf Megan cooked filled the air with a smell that took me back to happier times, Sunday dinners when Brian was still a boy and his mother was alive. I sat at the table and looked at them, my son and his wife, and for a moment I thought I saw my old dreams reflected in their eyes. I cleared my throat and lifted my glass. "I have news," I said, my voice warm with pride. Today was my last day at work. After 40 years, I finally retired. I expected clapping, maybe even a hug. I thought Brian would raise his glass, and Megan would smile. Instead, silence spread across that little kitchen like an unwelcome guest. Brian's fork slipped from his hand and clattered against the plate. Megan's mouth fell open, but not with joy. My heart began to sink, though I held my smile as if forcing it might turn their faces around. Brian's cheeks turned red. "You what?" he asked. "I retired," I repeated softly, still smiling. 40 years of service, son. I earned this. I thought we could celebrate tonight." His lips pressed into a hard line. He leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Dad, you cannot just quit like that." "Did you even think about what this means for us?" Before I could answer, Megan set her glass down with a thud. "Chris, your father thinks we're just going to carry him now. He expects us to feed him for free." Her words hit harder than a hammer. The warmth inside me froze. I had pictured laughter, maybe Brian clapping me on the back, telling me how proud he was of me. But what I saw instead was annoyance, even anger. "Listen, Dad," Brian said, his tone shifting into the voice he used at work, cold and commanding. "I am not keeping an extra mouth to feed. You need a job tomorrow. I do not care what at Island. You are not sitting here living off me." Each word landed heavy on my chest. This was my son, the boy I raised, the boy I carried on my shoulders when he was little, the boy whose education I scraped every dollar to pay for. I stared at him, barely recognizing the man across from me. The kitchen light carved shadows across his face, making him look like a stranger. Megan crossed her arms and nodded. "You are 66, not 90. Plenty of people your age still work. My neighbor's dad bags groceries until he is 73. I opened my mouth to explain, but Brian cut me off. "You think money grows on trees? You have any idea what it costs to run this house? To keep food on the table?" His voice rose, filling the kitchen like fire. I swallowed back the anger rising in me. "You are right," I whispered. "I should have talked to you first." His expression softened slightly, mistaking my restraint for surrender. "Look, Dad, I am not trying to be cruel, but reality is reality. We cannot afford a freeloader." That word cut deeper than the rest. I nodded as if defeated, though inside me something stirred. Megan gathered the plates quickly, her movements sharp and efficient. "The sooner he understands, the better," she muttered. They walked into the living room, the television clicking on. Their voices returned to normal tones, laughing at some joke on the screen, as if nothing had just been said at that table. I sat alone, staring at the empty chairs. The meatloaf on my plate had gone cold. The house groaned softly, the same house I had worked so hard to pay off. I slowly rose, cleared the dishes they left behind, and shut off the light. My small bedroom waited in the back of the house, plain and quiet. I lay down fully dressed, staring at the ceiling. 40 years of sweat and sacrifice, and this was what it came to. A son who saw me as a burden, a daughter-in-law who saw me as an expense. Their words echoed in my head like nails driven into wood. Retirement was supposed to be freedom. Instead, it became the start of something else. I closed my eyes, my chest tight, and wondered how long I could carry this silence. The night pressed heavy on me, and yet beneath the pain, something cold and steady began to grow, a seed of anger, a seed of resolve, and I knew this was only the beginning. The house was quiet, but my mind was not. I lay on my narrow bed, the mattress sagging in the middle, the sheets rough against my skin. I tried to close my eyes, tried to push away the sting of Brian's words, but they clung to me like smoke. Every time I drifted close to sleep, I saw his face, red with anger, and Megan's eyes sharp with contempt. My chest tightened, and I turned toward the wall that separated my room from theirs. That wall had always felt thin, but tonight it seemed to disappear altogether. At first I heard only the low hum of their voices, blurred and indistinct. I thought I should put a pillow over my head, spare myself whatever judgment was spilling out of their mouths. But something in me needed to hear. I held my breath, straining, and their words sharpened until each one cut clean. "He thinks he can just sit here all day," Brian said, his voice rising. "Like we're supposed to carry him. I work 50 hours a week, Megan. I am not feeding an extra mouth." My hands clenched the sheet so tightly my knuckles ached. The boy I had carried on my shoulders, the boy whose scraped knees I kissed when he was small, was now calling me an extra mouth. Megan's voice followed, cooler but sharper. "What if he refuses to work? What if he just sits around watching television all day? We could take his pension, or we could put him in a home. People do it all the time." A home. The words chilled me. My heart thumped so hard I thought they might hear it through the wall. Brian laughed, low and bitter. "Dead weight. That's what he Island been living off us since Mom passed. Free meals, free room, and now he thinks retirement means we support him. He's got no idea how expensive things are now." Dead weight. The phrase stuck in my chest like a stone. I had given that boy everything. I had skipped meals so he could eat, worked double shifts so he could go to college, sold the car I loved so he could have a wedding worthy of his dreams. And now, to him, I was nothing more than a problem to be solved. Megan's tone turned sly. "We give him a deadline. 1 week to find a job. If he doesn't, we put him out. If he complains, we remind him beggars can't be choosers." They both laughed then, their voices warm with cruelty. I lay frozen, the shadows from the streetlight carving patterns across my ceiling. I stared at those shifting lines and wondered how everything had twisted so far from what I had imagined. I thought about the checks I had written, the nights I had spent alone at the factory while Brian slept in a warm bed I provided. I thought about his graduation day, the pride that swelled in me as he walked across the stage, never knowing the sacrifices behind that cap and gown. I thought about his wedding, the flowers, the music, the cake I quietly paid for without asking for a word of thanks. Their voices faded into murmurs again, softer now, as they prepared for sleep. But the damage was done. Every word was burned into me. Dead weight, nursing home, beggar, extra mouth. The house settled around me, its familiar creaks and sighs no longer comforting but heavy with betrayal. I closed my eyes, but sleep would not come. Instead, images of the past flickered through me, each one colliding with the cruel reality of the present. My son saw me not as a father, but as a burden. My daughter-in-law saw me not as family, but as an expense. I pressed my palm flat against the cool plaster of the wall, as if I could push through time and space and remind them of the man who had carried them here. But all that came back to me was silence. When their bedroom lamp clicked off, the house sank into darkness. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to their laughter echo in my mind. Somewhere deep inside me, something shifted. The sadness began to harden, layer by layer, into something sharper. It was not rage that filled me, but a cold, steady anger, an anger that whispered to me in the dark. They thought I was weak. They thought I was finished. They thought they could decide my fate, plan my exile, steal the life I had built. But they had no idea who I really was. I lay still, my body motionless, my heart pounding, and began to think. My entire life had been built on patience, on waiting for the right time to act. Tonight, Through the thin walls of my own home, I had heard the truth about my son, and I knew now that I could never go back to the man I was before. The shadows shifted, the silence deepened, and I stared into the dark, planning what would come next. The night dragged on without mercy. Every time I closed my eyes, the words I had heard through the wall came back sharper, cutting me from the inside out. To quiet my mind, I forced myself to think of the past, to hold on to the moments that reminded me who I was and what I had given. Memories came like a flood, each one heavy with both love and sacrifice. I remembered the first time I held Brian in my arms. His tiny fist wrapped around my finger as if he already knew I would protect him. I whispered a promise that night in the hospital room. I promised I would give him everything I could, even if it meant breaking myself in half. And for years I kept that promise without hesitation. The steel plant was my second home. The clang of metal, the hiss of steam, the sting of sweat in my eyes. I worked through heat that made men faint, through winters so cold my breath turned to ice before it left my mouth. When Brian was in grade school, I picked up every overtime shift they offered. I came home late with my hands cracked and blackened, my body aching in ways I never admitted. But when I saw his backpack hanging by the door, I knew it was worth it. He would have new shoes when he needed them. He would never know the shame of going without. There were nights when the bills stacked higher than the paychecks. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with his mother, counting dollars like they were gold coins. She would ask if we could manage another month, and I would tell her not to worry. Then I would go to the factory supervisor and beg for another shift. When Brian wanted a baseball glove, I worked 2 weekends straight. I watched his face light up when I handed it to him, and that smile erased the pain in my back. College was the mountain that nearly broke me. Tuition notices came like waves crashing against a weak shore. Brian called one night in a panic, saying the fees had gone up again. He was afraid he would have to drop out. I told him not to worry, that his old man would figure it out. I hung up the phone and stared at the walls until dawn. Then I walked into the plant and signed up for double shifts every day for 3 months. I ate canned soup and crackers to save every dollar. When the bill came, I wrote the check with shaking hands, proud and exhausted. His graduation was one of the proudest days of my life. I sat in the bleachers, dressed in the same suit I had worn for 15 years, the fabric shiny at the elbows. I cheered until my throat burned as he walked across that stage. He never looked up at me, never waved, but it did not matter. I knew the road that had carried him there was built on my shoulders. Then came the wedding. He wanted more than we could afford, and I wanted him to have it. I sold my old car, the one I had dreamed of fixing up in retirement. I told everyone it was time to let it go, but the truth was, it paid for the flowers, the music, the cake. I watched him dance in his rented tuxedo, Megan glowing in her gown, and I stood in the shadows smiling. Nobody knew I had doubled the budget without saying a word. Every step of his life had been built on small sacrifices that felt enormous to me. I never complained. I never asked for thanks. I thought love was enough, that one day he would understand. I thought when I retired he would remember the nights I came home with blistered hands, the mornings I left before sunrise, the years I gave without question. But as I lay in that narrow bed, the sound of their laughter still echoing in my ears, I realized he had forgotten it all. To him, I was not the father who carried him through storms. I was just another expense, another mouth to feed. The weight of that truth pressed against me harder than any steel beam I had ever lifted. I stared at the ceiling until my eyes blurred, torn between sorrow and anger. All those memories I cherished had turned bitter, reminders of a debt that would never be acknowledged. And yet, beneath the pain, there was something else, a quiet fire beginning to spread. I had given everything, and now I would take back what was mine in a way he could never forget. I stared into the darkness of that room and let the memories of sacrifice turn into something steadier. My son thought I was a burden because I had never shown him the truth of what I carried. He saw the worn shirts I wore, the beat-up truck I drove, the small bedroom I kept for myself at the back of the house. He mistook modesty for weakness, simplicity for poverty. But he never knew the full story. Years ago, when Brian was still in high school, I met a man who carried dreams bigger than his wallet. His name was Richard Stone. He was younger than me then, burning with ambition, standing in a garage cluttered with old tools and wires. He told me he wanted to build machines that would change the way factories ran. Everyone else laughed at him, called him foolish, said he was wasting his time. But when I looked in his eyes, I saw the same fire I used to feel when I was young. I believed him. I had a small savings then, scraps of money I had tucked away over the years while still paying bills and tuition. It was not much, but it was all I had. I handed it to Richard and said, "Make something of it. I trust you." We shook hands in that dusty garage, the smell of oil thick in the air, two men betting on a future no one else could see. The years that followed were hard. There were nights I thought I had been a fool, giving away what little I had while I was still eating cheap dinners and patching old boots. But then, Richard's machines began to sell. His company grew from that small garage to a warehouse, then to an office building, then to a corporation with glass walls and marble floors. Stone Tech Industries became a name people respected, and all the while my share grew quietly in the background. Richard never forgot that first handshake. Every quarter he made sure I received my dividends. They came in quiet envelopes, plain statements that I locked away in a drawer. Sometimes I used the money to cover Brian's needs. Most of the time I let it sit, let it grow. I wanted to live simply, because I knew that wealth could twist people if they saw it too soon. I chose an old house, an old truck, and a life that looked smaller than it really was. I told myself I was teaching Brian a lesson, though now I wondered if the lesson had failed. He believed the surface and never looked deeper. He thought I was barely surviving, when the truth was, I had built a foundation stronger than he ever imagined. I owned a piece of Stone Tech, a company that employed thousands, a company his own paycheck came from without him knowing I was one of the hands behind it. I thought of Richard often, of the nights we stayed up late drafting plans on his workbench, the mornings he called to tell me another order had come through. He always said, "Jack, you gave me the start. I won't ever forget it." And he never did. He treated me as a partner, even when I let the world think I was just another factory man. Brian had never asked where his tuition really came from, or how his wedding suddenly became bigger than his budget. He assumed I had bled myself dry at the plant, and maybe that was easier for him to believe. He never suspected that the tired old man in front of him was quietly one of the largest shareholders in the very company that signed his checks. As I lay in that small room, listening to the quiet house around me, I felt a shift inside. For years I had chosen silence, chosen to hide my strength, chosen to let humility cover what I had built. But now I saw where that had led. My son thought he could throw me out of my own house. My daughter-in-law thought she could speak about nursing homes and pensions as if I were already gone. They thought I had no power, no future, no voice. They were wrong. The papers in the drawer by my bed told a different story. The bank accounts, the investment statements, the letters from Richard, all waiting quietly for the day they would be needed. I reached over and pulled the drawer open, running my fingers across the envelopes. I had hidden this truth for so long it felt almost like touching another life. I realized then that my wealth was not just in dollars. It was in the patience I had learned, the strength I had carried, the choices I had made. I had built something enduring, and I would not let anyone treat me like a beggar. My time for silence was ending. The next chapter would belong to me, not as a man begging for respect, but as a man who had earned it long ago. I closed the drawer and lay back down, the faintest trace of a smile on my face. They had no idea who they were underestimating. Soon enough, they would. Morning light crept through the thin curtains, painting pale stripes across the floor of my small room. I had not slept much, but I rose with a calm I had not felt in years. The night before had been filled with memories and revelations, but now it was time to put on a performance. I would give Brian and Megan exactly what they wanted to see. They thought I was beaten, thought they had broken me down with their talk of freeloading and nursing homes. Today I would wear the mask they had carved for me, the mask of surrender. When I stepped into the kitchen, Brian was already there, his tie knotted tight, a mug of coffee steaming in his hand. Megan stood at the counter buttering toast, her lips pressed into a straight line. They both looked up at me, waiting. I pulled out the chair and sat, letting my shoulders slump a little, softening my voice. "I've been thinking about what you said," I began, keeping my eyes down as though ashamed. "You're right. I can't just sit here. A man my age should still contribute. I'll find work." For a moment the room went silent. Then I heard the faintest sigh of relief from Brian. He set his mug down and leaned against the counter, the authority returning to his posture. "That's good, Dad. That's the right attitude." Megan turned, a flicker of satisfaction lighting her eyes. "See, it wasn't so hard, was it? You just needed to accept reality." I nodded, playing the role perfectly. "I'll do whatever is necessary. Honest work is honest work." "Oh." Brian straightened his tie, puffing out his chest. "Actually, I might have something. There's an opening at Stone Tech. A janitor's position. It's not glamorous, but it's steady. You'd start Monday morning at 7. The name of the company rolled off his tongue without him realizing the weight it carried. My chest tightened, not from fear but from irony. Stone Tech, the company I had helped build, the company where my shares still grew silently year after year. My own son, blind to the truth, was offering me a mop in a place where I belonged at the boardroom table. I kept my face calm, my voice even. "That sounds perfect," I said. Megan raised an eyebrow. "You're willing to clean offices?" I looked her straight in the eye. "Yes, honest work is honest work." She smiled thinly, her hand resting on Brian's arm. "Then it's settled. Chris will talk to his boss today." I let gratitude creep into my tone, just enough to feed their pride. "Thank you both. It'll feel good to have purpose again, to contribute something to the household." Brian nodded approvingly, as if I were a child finally learning a lesson. "That's the spirit. Maybe this will work out after all." Inside me, the anger coiled tighter, but I did not let it show. Instead, I leaned back, let my shoulders droop, and allowed them to believe they had won. They spoke of grocery lists and weekend errands, laughing softly between themselves, while I sat in silence, rehearsing the part I would play. When the conversation shifted away from me, I excused myself and returned to my room. Closing the door quietly, I sat at my desk and let the mask slip from my face. The weakness I had shown was nothing but an act, a performance tailored to their expectations. They wanted a defeated old man, and I had given them one. But beneath the surface, the real man was still there, stronger than they remembered, sharper than they suspected. I opened the drawer again, pulling out one of the envelopes from Stone Tech, the statement of dividends neatly printed in black ink. I ran my finger down the page, my eyes tracing the numbers that told the truth of my life. I was not a burden. I was not an extra mouth. I was an investor, a partner, a man who had chosen to live simply while his wealth grew quietly in the shadows. I slipped the paper back into the drawer and closed it with care. Let Brian believe he had bent me to his will. Let Megan smile at her small victory. Their confidence was the rope they were weaving around themselves, and I would let them tighten it with their own hands. The house buzzed with ordinary sounds, the clink of dishes, the murmur of voices, the slam of the front door as Brian left for work. I sat alone, the mask still warm on my face, and whispered to myself, "Patience." End of 40. In the eyes of my son and his wife, I had surrendered. But in my own heart, I knew the truth. This was not defeat. This was the opening move. Monday morning arrived sharp and cold. Brian had spent the weekend talking about my new job as if he were a general preparing a soldier for battle. He bought me a set of cleaning supplies, a plain uniform folded neatly in a plastic bag, and repeated the schedule so many times I could have recited it in my sleep. 7 o'clock sharp. No excuses. He even wrote it down on a slip of paper and left it on the kitchen table as if I were a forgetful child. I nodded through it all, my face showing gratitude, my voice quiet and submissive. Inside, though, I was counting the hours until the moment came. That morning, I rose before dawn, dressed in my old work clothes, and sat at the kitchen table sipping coffee. The uniform stayed folded by the door, untouched. I could almost hear Brian's footsteps in my mind, his voice rehearsing the proud introduction he planned to make when he showed his boss that his father was finally useful. I smiled into my cup, thinking about how quickly that pride would twist into panic. At 7:30, I was still at the table, calmly buttering a slice of toast. The phone began to vibrate across the wood. Brian's number glared back at me. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering with a tone of innocent confusion. "Dad, where the hell are you?" His voice was sharp, almost frantic. "Leonard was waiting for you. You were supposed to be here at 7. I widened my eyes, though he could not see me. "Oh my, I must have mixed up the time. I thought it was 8. You know how these old brains work." "You've got to be kidding me," he snapped. "I vouched for you. I told him you were reliable. Now I look like a fool." "Oh." I let a pause hang in the air, just long enough for his frustration to grow. "I'm sorry, son, I really am. Maybe I can still come in later today, make up for it." No. You'll be there tomorrow at 7:45 sharp. Not a minute later. Do you understand?" "Yes, of course," I said softly, as if chastised. "I won't let you down again." But I could hear it in his voice. The cracks were already forming. He had marched into his boss's office full of pride, and now he stood there humiliated, trying to explain why his own father could not keep the simplest commitment. The thought of it filled me with a quiet satisfaction I had not felt in years. After he hung up, I set the phone down gently and leaned back in my chair. The house was still, the morning sun spilling across the floor, and for the first time in a long time I felt like I was in control. The first move had been made, and it had landed exactly as I intended. Brian was rattled, embarrassed, and scrambling. I walked into my room and opened the drawer where the envelopes rested, my hidden truth waiting in silence. I did not take them out this time. I only looked at them, reminding myself of the power they represented. He thought I was powerless, thought I was at his mercy. He had no idea that I was only playing the part he had written for me. The rest of the day passed quietly. Megan hardly looked at me, though I noticed the slight curve of her lips when she thought about my mistake. She believed it proved her point, that I was just an old man slipping further into uselessness. I let her think it. Every careless word they spoke, every laugh they shared at my expense was fuel for what I was building. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed Brian's voice in my head, the edge of desperation when he realized he had been made to look small in front of Leonard. Tomorrow, I would show up on time. Tomorrow, I would play the obedient worker just long enough to set the stage for what was coming. Sometimes the smallest mistake, carefully placed, can shake a man's confidence more than the fiercest argument. And that morning, with nothing more than a missed shift and a feigned apology, I had reminded my son that even when he thought he held the reins, I could still tug the strings from the shadows. The next afternoon the house was quiet, except for the soft ticking of the clock in the living room. Brian was still at work, and Megan had come home early, a stack of folders tucked under her arm. She moved quickly through the kitchen, tossing her purse onto the counter and spreading papers out like a dealer at a card table. I stayed in the hallway, just out of sight, pretending to be fumbling with the coat rack. From where I stood, I could see numbers scrawled across invoices, columns of figures that did not add up. I had spent 40 years staring at ledgers, managing budgets for machines that cost more than my house. I knew the look of clean numbers, and I knew the smell of rotten ones. What I saw spread across that counter reeked. Megan's phone rang, and she snatched it up. "Yes, I'll have the reports by morning," she said briskly. "Don't worry, I've adjusted everything." Her voice lowered as she turned toward the window, giving me a better view of the papers. One invoice claimed $800 for office supplies I knew would not have cost more than $300. Another showed maintenance fees bloated by hundreds. My pulse quickened. These were not small mistakes. These were deliberate alterations, clean enough to fool anyone not looking closely, bold enough to funnel steady amounts of money into the wrong pockets. She left the room for a moment, and that was all I needed. I stepped quietly to the counter, my eyes scanning the pages, my fingers itching to pick them up, but careful not to move them out of place. Dates, vendors, amounts, all of it painted the same picture. Megan was stealing. I slipped my phone from my pocket and snapped a few quick photos, the shutter muffled by my thumb, just enough evidence to remind myself of what I had seen. Then I stepped back to the hallway as her footsteps returned. She gathered the papers, stacked them neatly, and slid them back into her bag without the faintest idea I had been standing 10 feet away, memorizing every detail. That evening she was her usual self. Sharp words softened by a glass of wine, laughter that never reached her eyes. She set the table and asked me if I had remembered my schedule for the morning. The words dipped in sarcasm. I smiled faintly and nodded, though my thoughts were miles away, circling those invoices like hawks over prey. When I finally retired to my room, I pulled out my phone and studied the images under the glow of the lamp. Every figure, every inflated total was clear. This was no accident. She had built herself a little stream of money, careful enough to go unnoticed, greedy enough to keep repeating it. I thought of Brian, so quick to call me a burden, so eager to strip me of dignity. Did he know his wife was stealing? Did he laugh in bed at night with her, thinking of me as dead weight while she funneled cash into handbags and jewelry? Or was he blind to it, as blind as he was to me? I felt no pity. What I felt was opportunity. Their cruelty had already given me reason to act, but now fate had handed me a sharper tool. Megan's secret was the crack in the wall, and I knew how to drive it open. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the distance filling the silence. My mind was clear, sharper than it had been in years. I had stumbled on something powerful, something that could bring their little empire of arrogance crashing down. Through the thin wall I heard them again that night. Brian's voice low, tired. Megan's sharper, restless. They spoke of bills, of expenses, of how tight money had been. I almost laughed at the irony, knowing what I now knew. My son worried about grocery bills while his wife bled her company dry. I turned off the lamp, my lips curling into the faintest smile in the dark. They thought they were planning my end, but in truth they had already sown the seeds of their own downfall. All I had to do was wait, watch, and move when the time was right. The photos I had taken burned in my pocket like live coals. Every time I looked at them, the numbers glared back at me, bold and crooked, daring me to do something about them. Megan carried herself like a woman in control, her voice crisp when she spoke on the phone, her smile tight but confident. She had no idea I had seen behind the curtain. She had no idea her secret was no longer hers alone. I knew better than to act in haste. 40 years in the factory had taught me that mistakes are made when men move too fast. Steel had to be tempered slowly, fire and pressure balanced just right. The same was true here. If I pushed too soon, the whole thing might collapse in a way that gave them warning. What I needed was proof solid enough to crush them under its weight. There was only one man I trusted for that, Michael Richardson. He had been a numbers man back when we both worked on budget committees for the plant, a quiet fellow with a sharp eye and a mind that saw through lies like glass. When others retired, Michael went on to become a forensic accountant. We had not spoken in years, but I knew he would still answer if I called. One evening, when Brian and Megan were out, I sat at my small desk and picked up the phone. My fingers hovered over the keys for a moment before I dialed. His voice on the other end was older but steady. "Jack Miller," he said after I introduced myself. "I was wondering when you'd finally need me again." We talked for a while, circling the years we had missed. Then I lowered my voice and told him what I had seen. I described the invoices, the numbers that did not match, the careful inflation that added up month after month. He listened without interruption, then asked me to send him the photos. Within days, he called back. "You were right," he said. "I checked Henderson and Associates through some channels. Their actual expenses don't line up with the reports. Your daughter-in-law has been skimming, small amounts but consistent. She's clever, but not clever enough. I sat in silence, letting the confirmation settle over me. What I had suspected was now fact. Michael promised to gather more, to discreetly pull the original invoices and vendor receipts. He would build the kind of file that no one could ignore. Meanwhile, I carried on my role inside the house. Megan would sweep in with her folders, toss her purse on the counter, and never notice the quiet eyes watching her. Brian would grumble about his long hours, never realizing that his wife's lies were adding weight to his shoulders. I kept my mouth shut, nodding when spoken to, smiling faintly when they mocked me. The mask of surrender remained firmly in place, but beneath it my mind was moving with precision. Nights were the hardest. I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, the sound of their muffled voices drifting through the wall. Sometimes they laughed about me, sometimes they argued about bills. I listened to it all, storing every word like a man storing ammunition. They had no idea the ground beneath them was already shifting. A week later, Michael sent me a file. He had scanned dozens of documents, pairing Megan's doctored reports with the originals. The discrepancies were impossible to ignore. Side by side, the theft shouted its presence. Along with the file came his note. "This is enough to bury her. Use it when you're ready." I printed a copy and tucked it into a plain folder. Then I slid the folder into the bottom drawer of my dresser, beneath old socks and shirts no one ever touched. Every time I passed that drawer, I felt its weight. Not just paper and ink, but power. I went about my days quietly, making breakfast, pretending to fuss over my schedule, asking Brian to repeat the details of my supposed job. He rolled his eyes at me, convinced I was slipping further into uselessness. Megan looked at me with thinly veiled impatience, as if waiting for me to stumble so she could prove her point again. I gave them both exactly what they wanted to see, but inside I was calm. My patience was not weakness, it was strategy. I had the evidence, I had the truth. All that remained was waiting for the right moment to let it loose. And when that moment came, it would not just be Megan who felt the blow. It would be Brian too, because arrogance built on lies never survives when the truth finally steps into the light. It was late afternoon when I heard the front door slam harder than usual. The sound carried through the walls, followed by the hurried rhythm of heels across the floor. I set aside the newspaper and looked up just as Megan appeared in the doorway. Her face was pale, blotchy from tears, her eyes rimmed red, her hair falling loose from the neat bun she always wore. Her purse dangled from her arm, clutched like a lifeline. She dropped into the nearest chair without a word. For a moment the only sound was her shaky breathing. Then it came, broken and desperate. "They suspended me," she whispered. "Pending investigation. They said there were irregularities." I kept my face carefully neutral, leaning forward with a look of practiced concern. "What kind of irregularities?" She covered her face with her hands. "Expense reports, invoices. They think I've been stealing." The word cracked in her throat like glass breaking. "Someone sent them proof. Detailed proof. My boss said he had no choice." I drew in a slow breath, feigning shock. "That sounds serious, Megan." Her eyes darted up to mine, wild and searching. "You don't understand, Jack. They have everything. Side-by-side reports, bank statements. Whoever did this knew exactly what to look for. It's like they've been watching me." I let silence hang in the air, then shook my head slowly. "That must be terrifying." She buried her face again, sobbing quietly. I watched her shoulders shake, the strong and polished woman I had known unraveling in front of me. There was a strange symmetry in it. She had called me dead weight, laughed about sending me to a home, and now here she was, clinging to the edge of her own collapse. The front door opened again, and Brian's voice echoed down the hallway. "Megan? Dad? I'm home." His steps were heavy, the sound of a man dragging the weight of another long day at work. He appeared in the doorway and froze when he saw his wife in tears. The briefcase slipped from his hand. "What happened?" Megan tried to speak but could not. Her words came out in gasps. They think I stole money. Someone exposed me. They're investigating. Brian's face drained of color. He turned toward me, his eyes sharp with accusation. What did you do? I raised my hand slowly. I didn't do anything. She came home like this. Don't lie to me, he snapped. First you embarrassed me at work by not showing up. Now she's in tears. You've been stirring trouble, haven't you? Megan reached for his arm, shaking her head. It's not him, Chris. The evidence came from someone at my firm. Anonymous. They have files, documents I can't explain. I don't know how they got them. He stared at her, then at me, torn between fury and disbelief. Irregularities, he muttered. Do you have any idea what this means? If you lose your job, if they press charges... I know, she cried. I know we could lose everything. The living room air grew heavy, thick with panic. Brian began pacing, running his hands through his hair, muttering to himself. This can't be happening. Not now. Not when I'm already under pressure with Dad. First him, now you. My life is unraveling. I sat quietly, letting their fear echo through the house. I could see the tremor in Brian's hands, the way his chest rose and fell too fast. Megan clutched her purse like it could shield her from what was coming. For the first time, the walls of their confidence cracked. Someone set me up, Megan whispered, her voice hoarse. But who would do that? Who would want to destroy me? I gave a slow shake of my head. I couldn't say. But whoever it is, it sounds like they knew exactly where to strike. Brian stopped pacing and looked at me again, suspicion still burning in his eyes. But this time, there was something else underneath it. Fear. He was beginning to realize the ground he stood on was not solid. The evening dragged on in fragments. Megan retreated to the bedroom, slamming the door, muffling her sobs with pillows. Brian sat at the table, staring at nothing, a glass of whiskey sweating in his hand. I stayed in my chair, silent, calm, watching as their house of lies trembled under the weight of truth finally catching up to them. The balance of power had shifted. For years they had seen me as the weakest man in the room. Now they were the ones unraveling, and I had not lifted a finger in their eyes. All I had done was sit still, silent, patient, and still the walls shook around them. The night after Megan came home in tears was one of the most restless I had lived through in years. Their voices drifted through the thin walls long after midnight, rising and falling in sharp bursts. She pleaded with him, swearing she could explain things, that it was all a misunderstanding. He shouted back about ruined reputations and mounting bills. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, letting the chaos run its course. By morning the house was silent, except for the sound of the coffee pot sputtering in the kitchen. When I walked in, Brian was already dressed. His eyes were ringed with fatigue, his jaw tight, his tie knotted too hard. On the chair by the door sat the janitor's uniform he had bought for me. Plain gray, stiff fabric, folded with the precision of a man desperate to control at least one corner of his life. He pointed to it without a word. "Put it on," he said finally, his tone clipped. I picked it up slowly, feeling the rough fabric between my fingers. He thought it was a mark of shame. To him it meant defeat, submission. I slipped it over my shoulders, buttoned it to my throat, and looked at myself in the hallway mirror. An old man in a cheap uniform stared back, his face lined and weary. But in his eyes there was something else, something Brian could not see. Behind that reflection was the smile of a man who knew the truth. Megan came into the kitchen, her hair loose, her eyes still swollen from crying. She looked at me in the uniform and gave a short laugh. "Well, doesn't that suit him?" she said bitterly, reaching for her mug of coffee. I only smiled faintly, as if her words had slid off me like water off stone. Brian drove us in silence. The car smelled of stale coffee and tension. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw set as if every mile brought him closer to the gallows. I sat in the passenger seat, calm, the fabric of the uniform scratching against my skin. Every time I caught my reflection in the window, the corners of my mouth lifted. We pulled into the parking lot of Stone Tech just after 7:30. The building rose before us, all glass and steel, polished like the future itself. I remembered when it had been nothing more than Richard's garage, with a single machine sputtering in the corner. To walk back into it dressed as a janitor was almost comical. Brian parked close to the entrance and turned to me. His voice was low and urgent. "Listen carefully. You do exactly as you're told. No mistakes this time. I do the talking. You keep your head down." "Of course, son," I said softly, lowering my eyes. He didn't notice the curl of my lips as I stepped out of the car. Inside, the lobby gleamed under bright lights, the marble floor polished to a mirror. Employees rushed by with briefcases and coffee cups, too busy to notice the old man in a janitor's uniform following a manager with tense shoulders. I let the mop handle rest in my hands like a stage prop, part of the act I had agreed to play. Brian thrust a bucket at me, whispering sharply, "Hold it properly. Don't embarrass me." I adjusted the handle, my expression blank, but inside I was smiling. Every detail of this charade was feeding his illusion of control, and every step brought him closer to the moment when it would crumble. We walked through the main corridor, past walls lined with plaques and photographs of the company's milestones. I saw Richard's face in many of them, grinning with a younger version of myself by his side. None of the passing employees gave me a second glance. To them, I was invisible, just another worker blending into the machinery of the company. I carried the disguise like a cloak, and it pleased me. Brian's stride quickened. I could tell he was nervous, though he tried to cover it with the stiff posture of authority. He thought today would prove something. He thought showing his boss that his father was willing to scrub floors would restore the respect he had lost. What he didn't realize was that respect is never earned through humiliation, only destroyed by it. As we turned a corner, the mop bumped lightly against the wall. Brian whipped his head around and hissed, "Careful." I lowered my eyes and muttered an apology, playing the part of the clumsy old man. His lips pressed tight, satisfied he had put me in my place. He had no idea the smile was still there behind my lowered head. Every step deeper into that building brought back memories. Long nights working with Richard, endless conversations about risks and dreams, the pride we felt when the first order came through. Now, to stand here disguised as nothing more than a janitor was a test of my own patience, but patience was something I had in abundance. I gripped the mop handle lightly and followed Brian toward the executive wing. Around us, the hum of the company buzzed on, the sound of phones ringing, conversations clipped and urgent. He thought I was beneath it all, a relic sweeping up the dust of his world. But I knew better. This was still my world, built on my faith, my money, my years of sacrifice. And soon, very soon, the man walking ahead of me would learn that truth. The uniform scratched against my neck, but I didn't mind. It was only fabric. Behind it was the smile of a man who had already won. The hallway opened wide into the main corridor, polished marble stretching under the glow of ceiling lights. Conversations buzzed around us, the steady hum of a company in motion. Men in suits passed briskly with phones pressed to their ears. Women in heels clicked past carrying folders stacked high, and not one of them looked twice at the old man with a mop. I kept my head lowered, my shoulders slightly bent, letting the disguise wrap around me like a second skin. Brian's stride was stiff, his chin high, his face arranged into the mask he wore at work. He had convinced himself that today would save him. I could almost hear the words rehearsed in his head, the pride he would feel when he introduced me as a man finally willing to earn his keep. He did not know he was walking straight toward the edge of a cliff. And then I saw him, Richard Stone, my oldest friend, the man I had believed in when no one else would. He was walking toward us from the far end of the corridor, tablet in hand, his silver hair neatly combed, his presence filling the space like it always had. My chest tightened, not with fear but with a strange anticipation. Brian spotted him too and straightened even more, his manager's smile spreading across his face. He nudged me sharply, whispering, "Stand up straight. Look grateful." I nodded, gripping the mop handle lightly, playing the part he needed me to play. "Mr. Stone!" Brian called out, his voice loud and eager, drawing Richard's attention. Richard looked up, his steps slowing as his eyes shifted from Brian to me. At first his face was blank, then confusion flickered across it, and finally something harder settled in his expression. "Perfect timing, sir," Brian said, puffing out his chest. "I've solved our staffing problem and a family problem at the same time. This is my father. He's agreed to take the janitor's position." The words hung in the air like a stone dropped in still water. For a heartbeat, the corridor seemed to pause. Conversations dulled, footsteps slowed, a secretary carrying files glanced our way. Richard stopped completely, staring at me as if he could not believe what he was seeing. His gaze moved to the mop in my hands, then back to my face. Recognition dawned, sharp and undeniable. "Brian," Richard said, his voice low but carrying. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Brian's smile faltered. He glanced at me, then back at Richard. "Sir, it's not a big deal. He wanted to contribute. He's been idle at home, and I thought this would be a good solution." Richard's eyes darkened. His voice rose, firm and cutting through the hum of the building. "You brought Jack Miller into my company with a mop in his hands, and you're proud of yourself?" Jack Miller, one of the largest shareholders of Stone Tech, the man without whom this company would not exist. A hush fell over the corridor. Employees stopped walking, their eyes turning toward us, whispers beginning to stir. The mop slipped slightly in my hand as I straightened to my full height, the act of submission falling away like an old coat. Brian's face drained of color. His mouth opened and closed without sound. "That's impossible," he whispered. He's just my father. He worked in a factory his whole life." Richard's voice sharpened further, echoing off the marble walls. 25 years ago, your father believed in me when no one else would. He invested $500,000 when I had nothing but ideas in a garage. Without him, there would be no Stone Tech, no office, no paychecks, not even your position. And you march him in here like a beggar? Gasps rippled through the gathered employees. Someone dropped a paper cup, the splash echoing as it hit the floor. All eyes were on Brian, his cheeks red, his hands trembling at his sides. I didn't know," he stammered. "Nobody told me." Richard's fury did not waver. "It was not hidden. You never cared to look. And now you've humiliated him, and yourself, in front of half the building." He turned sharply. "Clear out your office. Effective immediately. You're done here." Brian's head jerked back as if struck. "Fired? You can't—" "I can, and I just did," Richard snapped. "Security will escort you out." The corridor was silent except for the distant ring of a phone. Brian stood frozen, his world collapsing in front of strangers. The briefcase in his hand slipped and hit the floor with a crack that echoed through the hall. Employees stared, some with pity, others with satisfaction. Richard turned to me then, his anger softening into something gentler. "Jack, my friend," he said, his voice heavy with respect. "What on earth is going on here?" I set the mop against the wall and stood tall, my back straight, my voice steady. "It's a long story," I said quietly. "One we should discuss in private." The crowd murmured as Richard gestured for me to follow him. Brian stayed rooted to the spot, pale and shaking, unable to meet my eyes. For the first time in years, I walked with my head high, each step measured, leaving behind the mop, the mask, and my son's illusions scattered on the marble floor. Richard's office had not changed much since the last time I had stepped inside. The mahogany desk gleamed under the morning light pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows, and the walls were lined with photographs of milestones I knew by heart. One showed the first machine rolling out of his garage, another captured the ribbon cutting of the first factory, and tucked in between were a few pictures of Richard and me, younger, thinner, shaking hands, smiling like men who had beaten the odds. He closed the door firmly behind us, and motioned me to the leather chair opposite his desk. "Sit down, Jack," he said quietly, though his eyes still burned with the anger I had seen in the corridor. Brian trailed in behind us, pale and shaken, his tie loosened, his lips trembling. He slumped into a corner chair without being asked, looking like a man who had lost all sense of direction. Richard stood behind his desk, hands gripping the edge. "Explain this to me. Why on earth did your son just introduce you as a janitor? Why were you holding a mop in my hallway?" I leaned back in the chair, feeling the weight of years settle off my shoulders. "Because that's what he believes me to be. That's what he wanted me to be. A dependent old man with no strength left, grateful for scraps." Brian shifted in his seat. "I didn't know," he mumbled. "I thought you were broke, Dad. You never told me anything." I turned to him, my voice steady. "You never asked, son. You saw what you wanted to see. An old man in a small room, driving a truck too old for the road, wearing the same shirts year after year. You thought that meant I had nothing, and you treated me like nothing." Richard's jaw tightened. "Jack owns 35% of this company. That's not nothing, Brian. That's the backbone of Stone Tech. He's been my partner from the beginning. Without him, there would be no company for you to collect a paycheck from. Do you realize that?" Brian buried his face in his hands. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't." I felt no pity. My voice grew firmer, cutting through the silence of the office. "I kept it quiet on purpose. I wanted to live simply, to see who you would become without money dangling in front of you. I thought maybe you would grow into a man of respect, a man who valued his father for who he was, not what he owned. But I was wrong." Richard came around the desk, his eyes still locked on Brian. "Wrong is too kind. What you did out there was cruel. You humiliated your own father in front of half the company, a man who built the very ground you stand on." Brian looked up, his face streaked with shame. "I thought I was helping. I thought giving him a job would make him less of a burden." The word twisted in the air, sharp and ugly. I leaned forward, my hands resting on my knees. "A burden. That's what you called me at home, too. You and Megan, whispering through the walls, planning nursing homes and deadlines, laughing about my pension. You had no idea I could hear every word." His eyes widened, the last thread of color draining from his face. "You heard?" "I heard everything," I said coldly. "The laughter, the cruelty, the plans to strip me of the life I built and toss me aside like garbage. After all I gave you. After every night I spent working so you could have an education. After selling my car so you could have a wedding you couldn't afford. And you still called me dead weight." The room grew heavy with silence. Richard stood motionless, his eyes flicking between us, fury written in the lines of his face. Brian swallowed hard, but no words came. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "Jack, what do you want me to do?" I took a long breath and looked out the window at the city below, the skyline glittering with the promise of a future I had helped create. "Nothing more needs to be done. He's already fired. That's enough." Brian flinched at the word as if it had finally sunk in. He sat slouched in the chair, staring at the carpet, his whole body trembling with the weight of his disgrace. I stood slowly, feeling taller than I had in years. This was never about money. It was about respect. And respect, son, is something you chose to throw away. Richard placed a hand on my shoulder, steady and firm. "You've carried this burden too long, Jack. It's time the truth was known." I nodded, my voice low but unwavering. "The truth has a way of unveiling itself, Richard. All you have to do is wait for the right moment." I turned back toward Brian one last time. His eyes were wet, his lips pressed tight, but I saw no apology there, only shock. The silence between us stretched, filled with everything he had done and everything he had lost. For the first time in a long time, I felt light. The truth was out, and the weight of their lies no longer rested on my shoulders. It rested squarely on his. The leather chair creaked as Brian sank lower, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the carpet as if it might open up and swallow him. Richard moved back behind his desk, his anger cooling into something sharper, a steady disapproval that cut deeper than shouting ever could. I remained standing, hands resting lightly on the edge of the chair I had just vacated, feeling no urge to sit. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, the silence heavy with judgment. Richard's voice was the first to break it. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done, Brian? Not just to your father, but to this company, to yourself?" Brian lifted his head a fraction, his eyes glassy. "I thought I was helping him. I thought if I gave him work, it would keep him busy, keep him from being a problem." I shook my head slowly, my voice quiet but firm. "A problem? That's all you saw when you looked at me? Not the man who carried you on his shoulders, not the man who bled for your education, not the man who held you steady when you stumbled. Just a problem to be managed." His lips trembled, but no words came. Richard leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. "Jack is not just an investor here. He is my partner. When no one else believed, he put everything on the line for me. He risked his family's savings on nothing more than faith. And you, his son, chose to parade him through my corridors with a mop in his hands. Do you have any idea the insult that is?" Brian's face twisted, half shame, half panic. "I didn't know. You kept it secret, Dad. You never told me." I took a step closer, my voice rising for the first time. "I didn't tell you because I wanted to see the kind of man you would be without money dangling in front of you. I wanted to know if you would treat me with dignity, even when you thought I had nothing. And now I have my answer." His eyes darted up to meet mine, desperate, pleading. "Please, Dad. I was under pressure. Bills, expenses, Megan. I thought I was doing the right thing." Richard slammed his hand on the desk, making him flinch. "The right thing? The right thing is respect. The right thing is gratitude. Two qualities you clearly lack." I drew in a long breath and let it out slowly. "When your mother was alive, she used to tell me that one day you would see all the sacrifices for what they were. She believed that when you had a family of your own, you would understand. But what I've seen is the opposite. You've turned cruel. You've turned blind." Brian's face crumpled, his hand running through his hair in frantic strokes. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I just wanted you to pull your weight." "My weight?" I leaned down, my eyes locked on his. "I paid your tuition when you couldn't cover a semester. I paid for your wedding when your budget collapsed. I even covered the down payment for the very house you live in, though you pretended you saved it on your own. I've been pulling your weight for most of your life, and you never once stopped to notice." He swallowed hard, tears glistening but refusing to fall. His voice was barely a whisper. "I thought you struggled. I thought you were poor." I straightened to my full height. "I chose to live modestly. There's a difference. I wore old clothes, drove an old truck, because I didn't want money to define me. I wanted to build something lasting. And I did. You just never cared to see it." Richard stood then, circling the desk to place a hand on my shoulder. "Jack, you don't need to explain yourself to him anymore. The truth is out. Everyone will know soon enough." But I kept my eyes on Brian. "You still have a chance, son. Not to fix what you've done today. Not to erase the words I heard you say through the walls of my own house, but to change who you are moving forward. Whether you take that chance or waste it, that's up to you." His lips parted, but the words never came. He sat frozen, caught between shame and stubbornness, a man stripped of the illusions he had built around himself. The office fell quiet again, broken only by the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. Richard gave my shoulder a reassuring squeeze. I had spoken my piece. The reckoning had come. What remained was no longer my burden to carry. I looked at my son and saw a man unraveling before my eyes. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie pulled loose, his hands twitching against the armrests of the chair. He had built a life on borrowed strength, and now that strength had been stripped away. For the first time he was seeing me as I truly was, and the truth crushed him more than any punishment I could have given. I spoke slowly, choosing each word as if it were a nail driven into the coffin of his arrogance. "Respect, Brian. That's the word you never learned. Respect for the man who raised you, for the sacrifices that carried you from a rented room to a college degree, from a small wedding budget to a celebration you couldn't afford. Respect for the father who gave everything and asked for nothing in return. His eyes glistened, but still he tried to speak. Dad, I didn't mean... I cut him off with a shake of my head. You meant every word. I heard you through the walls. I heard you and Megan laugh about sending me to a nursing home, about taking my pension, about how I was dead weight. You didn't say those things in anger. You said them in comfort, in whispers you thought were safe. That is who you are. His shoulders slumped further, and for a moment I thought he might cry. But pride held him back, the same pride that had poisoned his heart for years. I turned away from him, my eyes settling on the photographs that lined Richard's office walls. They showed the milestones of a company, but to me they were reminders of the nights spent hunched over a workbench, the mornings spent believing in something no one else saw. Each picture was a story of patience and loyalty, values my son had chosen to discard. Humility? I continued, my voice softer now, almost weary. That's the other lesson you missed. A humble man sees beyond himself. He doesn't measure people by what they can give him today, but by what they have already given. I lived simply not because I was poor, but because I valued peace over possessions. I let you believe I was struggling because I wanted you to see past money. Instead, you saw weakness where there was only restraint. Richard shifted beside me, his presence steady, his silence heavy with agreement. Brian rubbed his forehead, muttering under his breath, but I caught the words. I didn't know. I just didn't know. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the desk. You didn't want to know. It was easier to believe your father was useless. It made your pride feel bigger. But now the truth is here, and you cannot run from it. The weight of my words pressed into the room. The city lights shimmered through the tall windows, the sound of traffic faint and distant. Inside the office, time felt frozen, the three of us locked in a moment that would not let go. Finally I stood, pushing the chair back slowly. My knees ached, but my voice did not waver. I don't need your apology, Brian. I don't need your excuses. I need you to look at yourself and decide if this is the man you want to be for the rest of your life. Because the truth has a way of catching up, just as it caught up to Megan, just as it caught up to you today. His head dropped into his hands. His shoulders shook, though no sound came. Whether it was anger, shame, or grief, I couldn't tell. But for the first time, the mask of certainty was gone. Richard's voice broke the silence. Jack, you've said what needed to be said. He has heard it, whether he admits it now or later. Let him sit with it. There. I nodded, my eyes lingering on Brian one last time. The lesson has been given. What you do with it, son, will decide the rest of your life. I turned toward the door, Richard walking at my side. Behind us, Brian remained in that chair, small and silent, surrounded by the truth he had tried so hard to ignore. For once, I felt no anger, only the faint hope that somewhere inside the ruins of his pride, the seeds of respect and humility might finally take root. I walked out of that office with my head held high, the mop long forgotten in the corridor where Brian had first pressed it into my hands. The air felt lighter, each step easier than the one before, as though years of silence and humiliation had finally been lifted from my shoulders. Richard walked beside me, his presence steady, his voice low with quiet respect. You've carried this secret too long, Jack, he said. Now the world knows. There's no shame in letting them see who you really are. I nodded, though my eyes stayed fixed on the floor ahead. I never wanted money to be the measure of me. I wanted my son to see my worth without it. But now he knows the truth, and maybe that truth will weigh on him more than wealth ever could. We stepped into the lobby, and I felt the eyes of strangers still lingering on me. Some whispered to each other, others simply watched, their curiosity heavy in the air. I did not meet their stares. Respect could not be begged or demanded. It either came on its own or it was never real. Outside, the sunlight struck my face, warm and steady. I paused for a moment, breathing it in. For years, I had imagined retirement as a simple life, quiet mornings with coffee, evenings on the porch, days spent in peace. Instead, I had found myself caught in a storm of betrayal and cruelty. But now, standing in that light, I realized peace was not given, it was claimed. When I returned home that evening, the house felt different. Brian's car was still in the driveway, but I did not hear the rush of footsteps or the clatter of Megan's voice. I opened the door slowly and stepped inside. The air was thick, heavy with unspoken words. Brian sat at the kitchen table, his tie gone, his sleeves rolled up. His hands were folded on the wood, his eyes staring at the same spot where I had once told them about my retirement. He looked up when I entered, but there was no anger this time, no sharp words, only exhaustion, and something that might have been shame. "Dad," he began, but the word broke apart on his lips. I set my keys on the counter and pulled out a chair across from him. We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of everything that had happened pressing between us. Finally I spoke. "I am not here to punish you, Brian. Life will do that on its own. I am here to tell you that dignity is mine, and it will not be taken again. You can call me poor, you can call me weak, but you cannot take away what I've built. You cannot erase the truth of who I am." His eyes dropped, his hands trembling slightly. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I swear I didn't know." "I believe you," I said. "But ignorance is no excuse for cruelty. You treated me as less than a man in my own home. You mocked me when I had given you everything. That will not be forgotten. Whether it will be forgiven, only time can decide." He nodded, his chin dipping low, and for once he had nothing left to argue. The silence between us was thick but different than before. It was no longer filled with contempt. It was filled with the fragile possibility of change, though I knew better than to expect it too soon. That night I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. The sky painted in streaks of orange and gold as the sun slid down behind the trees. The air was cool, the kind that makes a man breathe deeper, as though each breath might carry him further away from the past. I thought of Richard, of the handshake in his garage so many years ago, of the faith that had built an empire. I thought of my wife, long gone, who had believed our son would one day understand. And I thought of Brian, sitting inside that house, broken by truths he had never imagined. I did not know what the future held. Maybe he would learn, maybe he would not. But my path was clear. I would live the rest of my days on my own terms, free of masks, free of lies, with dignity intact. The night settled around me, crickets singing in the distance, the porch light casting a gentle glow. I lifted my cup, took a slow sip, and let the warmth fill me. Whatever storm still waited ahead, I was no longer afraid. My life was mine again. My dignity was restored, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to simply sit in the quiet and smile. After years of sacrifice, silence, and humiliation, I finally stood tall with the truth unveiled. My son learned that dignity cannot be taken, only surrendered, and I chose to never surrender it again. Wealth may have remained hidden, but respect had to be earned in the open. In the end, justice was not in revenge, but in reclaiming my own worth. Life had delivered its lesson, and I walked away with peace in my heart. What about you, dear friends? Do you believe respect must be taught through pain, or can it be given freely? Share your thoughts below.